Shemai, hello everybody, and welcome to this AS Level English Literature Session 2 on Unit 2, the poetry collections. This is your extended essay question session. Hopefully you'll be able to find some really useful hints and tips here for how to best answer the extended essay question on Unit 2. Okay. So we're going into the exam, and the first thing that we need to do is to read the rubric for section B. This will be in the exam paper, and you'll have this in front of you, and it's really important to familiarise yourself with this particular rubric. So this is an open book exam, as we know. It's a 2-hour exam, and section B is worth 80 marks. Now, you will be given 2 questions on your poetry collections, and you answer one of those questions. You can take in a clean copy of the poetry text which you've been studying. So as we know, that means no annotations, no highlighting. When you go into the exam, the poetry collections that you take with you should be clean copy. Unlike Unit 1, where it's a closed book exam, in this exam you are allowed to take in the copies of the texts. Only prescribed editions must be used. Where prescribed sections of text are indicated in brackets, only poems from these sections can be included in your response. And then we've got a little bit more information, which we will go into in a bit more detail there. So the thing that we need to remember is this is an open book exam, and it's worth 80 marks, this particular question. You'll be given 2 questions, and you answer only one. Now, what I want to draw your attention to is this particular sentence. You must not choose or refer to any poems named in section A in your response to section B. And what that means is, in section A, where you were given a named poem or a named extract from a longer narrative poem, you cannot use those that are named in this section B. So whichever poem you chose in section A, as you only had to answer one question, it doesn't matter that you didn't answer on the other poem. You cannot use either of those 2 poems. So that's something very important that we must remember. Whatever 2 poems are named in section A, you cannot use those in the extended essay. So let's have a look at what we're expected to do. In your response, you are required to analyse how meanings are shaped, demonstrate understanding of the significance and influence of the contexts in which literary texts are written and received. You must explore connections across the set texts, and you must show how different interpretations have informed your reading. So essentially, in this exam question, you are being assessed on all of the assessment objectives, AO1 right through to AO5. And we're going to look in a second at what the mark breakdown is for that particular question. Okay. So the skills being tested then are your ability to write coherently and clearly, structuring an argument. That's 10 marks. So assessment objective 1 is out of 10 marks. Assessment objective 2 then, focused, close analysis of a number of poems. Again, 10 marks for that. Then we've got AO3. How relevant contexts illuminate the readings of the poet's work in the light of the question, and that's worth 20 marks. And then the big one then is AO4, your ability to make productive and illuminating connections between the poems, and that's worth 30 marks. Now, it's worth noting here that you are expected to explore the connections and the contrasts between the 2 poets, not between 2 poems really by the same poet. Okay, so your connections and your contrasts are going to be between the 2 different poets. And then your final assessment objective then is how other relevant interpretations illuminate the reading of the poems. So we've got our 5 assessment objectives, 3 of those with 10 marks, AO1, AO2 and AO5. AO3 worth 20 marks, and then the big one worth 30 marks is the connections, the contrasts, and the comparisons. Okay, so we need to bear those weightings in mind. Now, this is a 2-hour exam paper. Section A should have taken you about 45 minutes to respond, which would give you an hour and 15 minutes or at least an hour, say, on this particular question. If you find yourself still answering section A, you really need to be wrapping that up if you've gone into the second hour now, because this is worth double the marks of section A. So the best way to overcome that is to practice these exam papers using past exam questions before you actually go into the exam, because that timed practice is going to be absolutely essential to you being able to complete this exam paper in the allotted time. Okay, so let's have a look at some band 5 top mark rubric descriptions. The assessment objectives then, what exactly do they mean? So to get really high marks in AO1, you need to demonstrate perceptive discussion of the poems. You need to show a well-developed argument, an apt use of terminology with fluent expression. So we can break that down into 3 sections. Well-developed argument, apt use of terminology, and fluent expression for AO1. Now, what you are marked on in AO1 is your ability to construct an argument to this question well. It's your ability to use terminology effectively to highlight your argument, and it's also your ability to write fluently in the correct academic style. No colloquial language, no slang. Everything must be proofread and checked before you give that exam paper in. AO2 then. Band 5 responses are detailed, showing perceptive analysis and evaluation of techniques with apt use of evidence. So we can separate that then into 2 sections. We've got that detailed and perceptive analysis, and we've also got apt use of evidence, of textual support. Now for those 10 marks, there are 2 sections there. It's your ability to demonstrate detailed and perceptive digging in and analysis of what the language, form and structure that the poets have used, but also your ability to use apt textual support to back up those answers and those assertions that you have made. AO3 then. Perceptive discussion of the significance and influence of contexts with confident analysis of the wider context. So again, we can separate that into 2 sections. Perceptive knowledge and understanding of the significance and influence of contexts on the writers, and also confident analysis of the wider context surrounding not only those writers, but those particular poems. That's pivotal. AO4 then. Productive and discerning comparisons and connections between the poems. And now remember that that does include contrasts as well. It's not just the similarities and the comparisons and connections, but also the differences. So make sure you remember that. And then finally then AO5, confident and informed discussion of other relevant interpretations. Now, because this is AS level and not A2 level, there are certain sentence stems that you can use that will highlight to the examiner your awareness of alternative interpretations. What I mean by that is, for AS level, you do not have to memorize quotations and critical analysis from academic critics, but you can just use sentence stems such as an alternative interpretation could say, or other readers could acknowledge that. So it's that sentence stem that acknowledges that there could be another reading to this poem without having to memorize critical quotations. Okay. So how should we tackle this question? Let's have a look at a step-by-step approach. You've got an 8-step approach here. And the first thing we need to do then is to read both of the questions on offer. Select one, so select the one that you like the look of, and highlight the keywords and commands in the question. And what I mean by that is the question will be directing you to some theme or idea in the poems that will link the ideas together. And we'll look at that in a little bit more detail in the next slide. But essentially what that is hinting at is that they do not want you, the examiner does not want you to do a line by line by line approach of every poem that you choose. They want you to be selective. And the way to do that, first of all, is to have a look at the question and highlight what it is that we're meant to be looking for in the poems that we choose. Step 2 then is you need to decide on 4 poems. Okay, that's how many you need. 4, 2 from each poet that you're going to use to answer this response. Okay, so that's very important. You need 4, 2 from each. The next thing you need to do then, possibly the most important thing, is step 3. In your exam booklet, make a plan of the key points to make about the poems in light of the question. Now, you can do this planning either in the pink answer booklet. That's absolutely fine. You can plan on one page before going on to writing your response. If you don't want anybody to look, or the examiner to look at that plan, you can just put a cross through it and the examiner will know that that is a plan and you don't want it marked. If you forget to do this, don't worry. The examiner is a normal person. They will understand that that is a plan and that your response comes later on. So don't panic too much. If you would rather hedge your bets, what you can do is you can complete your plan in the question booklet. So remember, the question booklet doesn't go off to the examiner. The booklet with the questions in is taken in at the end of the exam, passed to the school's exam officer, and then eventually then, after a certain amount of time, that will go back up to the English department. So it never goes to the examiner. So you are free to use that booklet to complete your planning as much as you wish. Step 4 then, make sure that you've got an overview of the poet's work in light of the question, and then begin to look more closely at how meaning has been created. So what that is suggesting that you do is give an overview, a very brief overview, a succinct overview of the poem in light of the question before you dig deep into the meaning and exploration. Step 5, make a note of some contexts which would be relevant in light of the question. So we're still in that planning stage now, okay? But remember, AO3 is worth 20 marks, so it does really matter that you plan this correctly and you select relevant context. It's very important that we don't chunk our context. And what I mean by that is you mustn't plonk it at the start of the essay before you actually go on to analysing the poems. You have to weave the context into your analysis of the poems. That's where the marks are, rather than chunking the context in a sort of mini history essay. Step 6, ensure you include relevant and regular connections between the poems. So again, in the planning stages, we need to be drawing those connections, those comparisons, those contrasts. Step 7 then is to include relevant critical views or alternative readings. So remember, here is the section where we're going to be alternatively, this could be interpreted as, or another reader may interpret this as. So you're giving those signposted sentences to the examiner. And then finally, after all of that planning, you write your response, always focusing on the task. Now, all of that should take you about 15 minutes. And it's really, really beneficial to ensure that you plan effectively and consistently. A well-planned response with planning that takes 15 minutes will save you time later on when you're actually writing the response, and also will gain better marks because it will be well structured. So some top tips then. Emphasize the keywords of the question in the opening paragraph of your essay. That signposts to the examiner that you are focused from the outset and you know exactly what it is that you're meant to be exploring in this written response. Avoid a line-by-line approach to analysis. Now, this is something I touched on earlier on. You shouldn't go through each of the 4 poems line by line by line, analysing each line. It's not a good use of your time. It's not going to gain you any marks. In fact, there's going to be a lot of surplus analysis that's not relevant to the question. You need to be selecting 5, 6 sections of the poem that are relevant to the question, and that's what you'll be focusing your in-depth analysis on. Ensure all references to contexts are relevant and illuminating. Okay, so the context is there to illuminate your analysis, to show how you know that the poet has written in this particular way. Again, it shouldn't be chunked. And you need to develop a range of comparisons, connections, and contrasts. Remember, the most marks, 30 marks out of 80, go on A04, those connections, comparisons, and contrasts. So you must weave those throughout. So let's have a look at step 1 then in more detail with an example. So step 1 then is to read both questions, select one and highlight keywords and commands. And this is an example of a question. It doesn't matter if you haven't studied Philip Larkin and Carol Ann Duffy as your collections, because the questions will always be worded in a similar way no matter what collections you've studied. So this question then is, how far do you agree that Larkin and Duffy are alike in the ways in which they portray outsiders in society? You must analyse in detail at least 2 poems from each of your set texts. Okay, so we can see then that we can break this down. So the first annotation then, how far do you agree? That relates to the structure of your argument, and you need to address views on that topic. It's not your personal agreement. That is one interpretation, but that also invites you to demonstrate alternative interpretations. How far do you agree that Larkin and Duffy are alike in the ways they portray outsiders? Okay, so that alike section is inviting you to make those connections, but also the contrasts. Okay, so the key part of this question is the way they portray outsiders in society. That is the meat of this question. So you're going to be selecting 4 poems, 2 from each poet, that address that particular theme, the portrayal of outsiders in society. So when you read that, you should be starting to think about what poems that you could bring in to answer this response. And in light of that, when you've chosen your 4 poems, that is the theme that you need to be looking for, the portrayal of outsiders in society. So we're not going through line by line of each poem. We are selecting 5 to 6 key elements of each poem that answer that particular theme. You must analyse in detail at least 2 poems from each of your set texts. And that's just signposting for you how much you need to include in this particular essay. So steps 2 to 3 then. Let's have a look. So once we've read and annotated our question, or at least highlighted the key parts, we need to decide on 4 poems, 2 from each poet, which will help us answer this question. You need to make sure that the poems are relevant to the question and that you can connect and compare them. So from your revision, you should start to get ideas in your head about which poems would be best to use for this particular question. Step 3 then in your exam booklet, make a plan of the key points to make about the poems in light of the question. You should spend up to 15 minutes planning the structure of your response, balancing all 5 assessment objectives requires close planning. And again, I'm going to emphasize and stress that 15 minutes planning time will be so beneficial to you when it comes to actually writing the response, because your ideas will already be down on paper and you won't be trying to structure an essay at the same time as trying to remember everything you need to remember, because all of that will already be on the paper, and it'll be much more efficient, much quicker, and much less stressful for you. And you'll also gain more marks because the structure is important. Planning our structure then, let's have a look. When we are planning, so we're in the planning stage now before we're writing the response, our plan must include an overview of the poet's work in the light of the question. And then we need to begin to look more closely at how meaning has been created. So that's AO1 and AO2. So you've got your 4 poems selected. You need an overview of each of those 4 poems, and then you need to select 5-ish, maybe a little bit more, sections of the poem that are pertinent to the theme outlined in the question that you're going to explore in further detail. Your plan also needs contexts, which would be relevant in the light of the question. It needs relevant and regular connections between the poems, and it needs relevant critical or alternative readings. So you need to be addressing all of those assessment objectives in your plan before you begin writing your response. So let's have a think then about actually starting to write our response and how we might structure it on the page. So what I've got here is an example of an opening of this particular question, with some annotations on the side exploring how this candidate actually begins to gain marks. So I'm going to read this out now. Please feel free to pause the recording and read through not only the response but the annotations in the body of the essay to give you a good idea how we can begin to structure this response. Swarbrick states that many of Larkin's speakers are outsiders, reflecting perhaps the solitude which the poet experienced throughout much of his life. Duffy also explores outsiders in her poetry, but frequently uses speakers and personas, allowing her to explore situations which she has not experienced. Moreover, these 2 poets are often alike in their portrayal of outsiders. They depict the loneliness and sadness which is connected to being an outsider, but contrasting to this, as in much of their work, Duffy is more overtly optimistic, appreciating the opportunities to change or to acknowledge goodness, as opposed to Larkin, which appears to interpret being an outsider as an inescapable position and therefore creating a prevalent sense of stagnation through much of his poetry. So arguably, this is an opening paragraph. Now, your opening paragraph may not be as detailed as this, but please don't look at this and feel overwhelmed. Let's pick it apart now and see what exactly is being said. So this candidate has opened with an alternative critical interpretation. Swarbrick states that many of Larkin's speakers are outsiders. Okay, now equally as valid would be if the candidate had written, critics state that, or many critics believe that many of Larkin's speakers are outsiders, and that would gain equal amounts of marks to naming a particular critic, because it's AS level and you don't have to, you don't have to memorize those critical quotations. But what we've also got is some tentative language reflecting perhaps the solitude which the poet experienced throughout much of his life. So what we've got here is an abundance of the AOs. We've got AO5, alternative interpretation. We've also got AO1 and AO2 because there's a focus on the question, and a little bit of AO3 as well, relevant context about Larkin's life. And then what the candidate does then is go straight into a connection. Duffy also explores outsiders. Okay, so it's really concise and clear. The There's a connection built in there, but frequently uses speakers and personas, allowing her to explore situations which she has not experienced. So again, we've got a connection, we've got a contrast, and a little bit of context weaved in. Moreover, these two poets are often alike in their portrayal of outsiders. Okay, so we've constantly got those linking words. Also, moreover, however, okay. These are all linking words that you need to keep bearing in mind. So that's a really good example of how we weave the assessment objectives into our analysis. It's a mixed bag all the way through. Nothing is chunked and everything is interweaved together. So yeah, have a little pause there, have a little look at that. That's a lovely opening introduction before the candidate goes on to a little bit more in-depth analysis of the specific 4 poems. Okay, let's have a think then, recapping some do's and don'ts for this particular question. Do take time to read the instructions and the questions carefully in order to avoid making errors which will affect your overall mark. And what I mean by that is read the question really carefully, highlight the key parts of it, and make sure you are answering the question that is being asked, not the question that you think might be being asked or the question that you would rather be asked. You must be really specific in this at AS level. Marks are awarded easily, but they are also easily taken away if you start to veer off into a different direction to what the question is asking you. Do highlight keywords and commands in the questions. Okay, that will help to keep you focused. Do avoid a line-by-line approach to analysing the poems. Hopefully now you can see from the planning stage and also that opening section that you're not going to have the time to go through each poem line by line, and it's going to be detrimental to you because not all parts of the poem are going to be relevant to the question. Do be selective in your approach. Select the most relevant ideas from the poem, the most relevant parts of the context that illuminate the analysis, and the most relevant connections and contrasts. Do begin each essay with a clear reference to the task. It's a really good way to start because it signposts to the examiner straight away that you are focused on what it is you're meant to be doing. Do remember the assessment objective weighting of each section. AO1, so your ability to write coherently and use correct terminology, that's 10 marks. AO2, the analysis, the in-depth analysis and the apt textual support, that's 10 marks. AO3, relevant contextual interpretation and ideas, that's 20 marks. AO4, the connections, comparisons and contrasts is worth 30 marks, so the biggest one, and then alternative interpretations in AO5 is 10. 10, 10, 20, 30, 10. Always remember that. Do avoid any reference to any AOs apart from AO1 and AO2 in section A. So there's just as a little reminder really about the Unit 2 Section A, the first session in this in these recorded sessions. You must not answer using any other AOs in Section A because you will not gain marks for them. Do plan your Section B answer carefully to ensure the inclusion of all 5 assessment objectives. Again, I cannot stress enough the importance of that 15 minutes of planning of your essay. Do not use any poem named in Section A in your Section B response. Again, that's really, really important. If you do, it's called a rubric infringement. It's just really not light. It's not the end of the world, but don't put yourself in that position. Make sure you select different poems for your Section B. Do remember to use 4 poems, 2 from each poet in Section B, and avoid making links between poems by the same poet as a way of addressing AO4. That's really important as well. Your comparisons and contrasts need to be between the poets, not 2 poems by the same poet. Thank you very much, everybody. I really, really hope that that was useful for you, that the breakdown has given you some ideas about how best to revise for this particular section of Unit 2. It's been lovely to speak to you. Please check out the other recordings, and diolch yn fawr. Thank you very much.